The morning Roscoe Brooks rode into Calico Flats with a wanted poster, bearing his own face tacked to every fence post along Main Street. Sallie Kendrick was elbow-deep in bread dough, and absolutely certain her quiet life was about to be turned upside down. She had not been wrong about such things since the day her father rode out to check on the eastern pasture fence and never came back, and she had learned long ago to trust the particular prickling sensation that traveled up the back of her neck when something large was about to change. The dough was warm beneath her hands, the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon, and the prickling was so strong she nearly knocked the whole bowl off the counter. Outside the window of the Kendrick boarding house, the late October sun of 1882 hung low and copper-colored over the Arizona territory, painting the dust of Main Street in shades of burnt amber. Calico Flats was not a large town. It had a general store run by the Haverson brothers, a telegraph office that doubled as a post office, a barber shop, a saloon called the Copper Penny, a church whose steeple tilted slightly west, and the boarding house that Sallie had been running alone since her mother passed the previous spring. There were perhaps 200 souls in town, and another 100 scattered across the surrounding ranches and homesteads, and most of them were decent people trying to make something out of a hard piece of country. Deputy Marshal Hector Vane was not among the decent ones. Sallie had known this about Vane since the day he arrived from Tucson 14 months prior, wearing a badge that looked too shiny and carrying himself with the particular strut of a man who confused authority with virtue. He had a habit of collecting fines from the Mexican families on the south side of town for infractions that he invented on the spot, and he had once arrested old Thomas Begay, a Navajo man who traded dried herbs from a cart near the general store, for the crime of standing still too long. The actual territorial marshal, a man named Graves who operated out of Tucson, rarely visited Calico Flats, and in his absence Vane had appointed himself the full weight of the law. Sallie had filed a written complaint with the marshal's office in Tucson. She had received, in response, a form letter thanking her for her civic participation. She had gone back to running her boarding house and learning to pick her battles. The sound of horse hooves slowing on the street drew her to the window, and she wiped the flour from her hands on her apron and looked out. The man on the horse was something worth looking at, even from behind, even through dusty glass. He sat tall in the saddle on a dark bay mare who looked like she had been ridden hard, but was still full of heart, and he wore a trail coat the color of charcoal, with the collar turned up against the morning chill. His hat was dark brown and battered and pulled low, and even from a distance there was something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of a man who had carried weight for a long time and had gotten very good at it. He stopped in front of the Copper Penny, looked up and down the street slowly the way a man does when he is reading a place for the first time, and then he looked at one of the wanted posters on the fence post directly across from where he sat. He was still for a long moment. Then he reached up and pulled the poster from the nail with one gloved hand, folded it, and tucked it into his coat pocket. Sallie pressed closer to the window glass. He turned the mare in a slow half-circle, and for just a moment his face came into the light. It was a strong face, angular and weathered, with dark eyes that moved with a kind of careful intelligence. There was a scar along his jaw, pale and old, the kind that came from something that had happened years ago and had long since been made peace with. He might have been 28 or 30, hard to say exactly, but there was something in his expression that was neither young nor old so much as it was tired in a way that sleep alone could not fix. He looked directly at the boarding house. Sallie stepped back from the window. She stood in her kitchen with flour on her apron and her heart doing something ridiculous in her chest, and told herself firmly that she was a practical woman of 24 years who had no business making stories out of strangers on horses. And then she went to the front door and opened it anyway. He was already dismounting, looping the mare's reins around the hitching post with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times. He looked up when the door opened, and their eyes met across the short distance of the porch steps, and the prickling on the back of Sally's neck became something warmer and considerably more complicated. "I see you have rooms for let," he said. His voice was low and even, with a trace of something southern in it, maybe Tennessee or Kentucky. "I would be grateful if you had one available." "I have two available," Sally said, because she had learned that honesty was simpler than strategy. $1.50 a week includes supper and breakfast. Noon meal costs extra. He nodded. "That is fair." He came up the porch steps and removed his hat, which she appreciated, and she saw that his hair was dark and a little longer than fashion strictly approved of, and that there was a tiredness around his eyes that confirmed what she had thought from the window. "My name is—" "I know your name," she said quietly. He went very still. She kept her voice level. "I am not going to turn you away, and I am not going to run for the deputy. I run a boarding house and I take boarders, and that is the end of it. But I want you to know that I know, so that we are not pretending at something we are not." Roscoe Brooks studied her for a long moment. Up close his eyes were not quite black. They were a very dark brown, the color of river water over dark stone, and they were measuring her with the same careful attention she had noticed when he was reading the street. Whatever he found in her face seemed to satisfy something in him, because some of the tension went out of his jaw. "That is an unusual kind of welcome," he said. "I am an unusual kind of landlady," Sally said. $1.50 up front if you do not mind. Room is at the top of the stairs, first door on the left." He reached into his coat and produced the money without argument, and when he handed it to her, their fingers did not quite touch, and Sally was absurdly aware of the near miss. "Roscoe Brooks," he said, though she had said she already knew. It seemed like he wanted to say it himself, wanted to offer it to her directly rather than have it handed to him from a poster. She understood the distinction. "Sallie Kendrick," she replied, which he did not already know, and which she offered with the same intent. He went up the stairs with his saddlebags over one shoulder and his rifle in his hand, and Sally went back to her bread dough and stood at the counter, and did not think about the way the morning light had caught the lines of his face, and did not think about it some more, and then gave up trying and thought about it quite thoroughly until the dough was ready to rise. Roscoe Brooks had, according to the wanted poster she had seen tacked to the fence outside the Haverson Brothers General Store 3 days prior, robbed a Wells Fargo relay station outside of Benson, stolen a payroll strongbox, and shot a Pinkerton agent. The reward was $400, which was enough money to keep the boarding house running for the better part of a year. Sally had grown up hearing her father say that a wanted poster was a story told by the man with the printing press, and that the truth was usually somewhere between the poster and whatever the man on the poster would tell you himself. She had never had occasion to test that philosophy before. She was testing it now. She did not ask him questions at supper. There were 2 other boarders at the time, an itinerant printer named Mr. Castillo, who had been in residence for 3 weeks and who ate with the single-minded focus of a man who was not taking chances with a free meal, and a young schoolteacher named Miss Abernathy, who had arrived the previous month to take over the Calico Flats schoolhouse, and who was still in the process of being surprised by the territory on a daily basis. Neither of them appeared to recognize the new boarder, and Roscoe Brooks sat at the end of the table and ate his supper with good manners and said only what was asked of him and asked nothing in return. He helped clear the dishes without being asked. Sally noticed. The night was clear and cold the way only October nights in the Arizona high desert could be, and after her boarders had retired, she sat on the back porch in her coat with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold and watched the stars and thought about the situation she had elected to put herself in. $400 was a great deal of money. She was not wealthy. The boarding house was enough, barely enough, and there were months when barely was a word she examined closely. She was not going to turn him in. She had known that the moment she opened the door, and it was not a calculation so much as a certainty. The way the sun rising in the east was a certainty. The back door opened and Roscoe Brooks came out onto the porch. He had removed his coat, but he was still wearing his boots and his gun belt, and he carried a cup of coffee, and he stopped when he saw her. "I can go back inside," he said. "You can sit if you like," she said. He sat in the other porch chair, the one that had been her father's, and which none of her boarders had ever used because there was something about it that seemed to discourage casual occupation, and either he did not sense that or he was beyond being discouraged by furniture. They were quiet for a while. The desert made its nighttime sounds, insects and distance and the occasional complaint of something living in the scrub. "You are wondering about the poster," he said. "I am not going to ask," she said. "I know." He looked out at the dark. "That is why I am going to tell you." She waited. "The payroll was already stolen when I got there," he said. "I found the relay station the way you find a thing after the worst has already happened. The Pinkerton agent was alive when I left him. I put his wound up and I left him water and I rode to the next settlement for help. I did not take the strongbox." He paused. "I was there because I had been tracking the men who did take it. I had been tracking them for 4 months. Why were you tracking them?" The silence that followed was not evasive so much as it was careful, the silence of a man deciding how much of a wound to show a stranger. "The man who took that payroll is named Cutter Doane," he said at last. "He killed my brother 3 years ago outside Prescott. My brother was 19 years old and he was riding for the Territorial Survey Office, and Doane's men hit the survey party for their equipment, and their horses and Jesse got in the way." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked once. He was 19. Sallie did not say she was sorry because she had learned that sorry was not always what grief needed. "And the law did not go after Doane. The law in that part of the territory was on Doane's payroll at the time." His voice was flat, not bitter exactly, just stripped of any surprise. "It has been improved since then, but Doane moved on and what was left of the law had other business and Jesse did not have anyone to push for him except me. So you have been pushing." "For 3 years." He looked at his coffee cup. "I found him twice, lost him twice. Found the trail again outside Benson. And by the time I got there, he had already made his move and gone, and I was standing in a burned-out relay station holding a dying Pinkerton agent and looking like every inch of what that poster says I am." Sallie thought about this for a long moment. The stars were very bright and very cold above the desert. "The Pinkerton agent," she said. "You said he was alive when you left him." "He was, a beat. I sent a wire to the Pinkerton office from Tombstone 2 weeks ago. I do not know if they got it. I do not know if it helped." "It might have," she said. "It might have," he agreed. The coyotes were singing somewhere out past the edge of town, that liquid rippling sound that newcomers to the territory found unnerving, and that Sallie found as familiar as breathing. She wrapped both hands around her cold coffee cup and looked at the man sitting in her father's chair and thought that the world was a very complicated place and that she was glad it was, on balance, even when it was difficult. "You should know," she said, "that Deputy Vane will come here. He makes rounds of the boarding houses when there is a wanted man in the territory. It is practically the one thing he does reliably." Roscoe looked at her steadily. "I know. And what do you intend to do about it?" "I intend to be gone before he comes," he said. "I am only stopping to rest the mare and resupply. I will be gone by dawn." Sallie looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest, something practical and sensible and well-organized, said yes. That is the right answer. Let him go before the morning and do not make this your complication. Something else in her chest, something she had less categorical language for, said nothing at all but was very loud about it. "The mare needs at least 2 days, she said. "I can see from here that she is favoring her left foreleg. You push her before that heals and you lose her." Roscoe looked at his coffee cup. "I noticed," he said quietly. "Then you were planning to leave anyway on a horse you already knew was lame." He did not answer, which was itself an answer. "Stay 2 days, Sallie said. "Vane does his boarding house rounds on Wednesdays and it is Monday. You will be gone before he comes." Roscoe was quiet for a long time. When he finally looked up at her, his expression was something she did not quite have words for, something between gratitude and bewilderment, as though kindness delivered without agenda was a language he had not spoken in long enough that it required translation. "All right," he said. "2 days." She went inside and left him on the porch with the coyotes and the stars in her father's chair, and she went to bed and lay awake for a considerable amount of time, and eventually concluded that she was in very serious trouble, and that the trouble had dark eyes and a scar along his jaw and a dead brother and a lame horse, and that there was absolutely nothing sensible she could do about any of it. The next day was the kind of October day that the Arizona Territory produced occasionally, as though to remind you why you stayed. All blue sky and golden light and air that tasted clean and faintly of juniper. Sallie had bread to bake and accounts to balance and a loose shutter on the east window that had needed tending for 2 weeks, and she set about all of it with the organized efficiency that was her natural mode of operation. Roscoe came down for breakfast at 7 and ate without rushing and offered to look at the shutter when he noticed her examining it, and she handed him the hammer and nails without ceremony and watched him climb the outside ladder with the easy competence of a man who was comfortable with physical work. He had the shutter fixed in 15 minutes and the 2 nails replaced in the porch railing she had not mentioned in another 5, and when he came back inside, she fed him a second cup of coffee and a piece of bread that had just come out of the oven, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked. Not about Cutter Doan, and not about Jesse, and not about wanted posters. They talked about the territory, about the particular quality of the light in the high desert in autumn, about the fact that the Haverson brothers had recently acquired a subscription to a newspaper from San Francisco that came 3 weeks late, but was nonetheless read with tremendous enthusiasm by everyone in Calico Flats. They talked about the schoolhouse and Miss Abernathy's ongoing battle with a curriculum that had not been updated since 1871, and about Mr. Castillo and the small newspaper he was trying to establish in the territory, which Sallie thought was brave and Roscoe thought was possibly the most dangerous occupation in the Arizona Territory, which made Sallie laugh. She had not laughed like that in a while. Since her mother had died, the house had been quiet in a way that was not unpleasant but was heavy, and the sound of her own laughter in the kitchen surprised her a little, and then felt like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Roscoe was looking at her with an expression she could not quite catalog, something warm and careful and attentive, and when she stopped laughing and caught his eye, they held the glance a beat too long, and then both looked away at different things simultaneously, and the kitchen felt much smaller than it had a moment before. She sent him out to check on the mare in the afternoon, partly because the mare genuinely needed attention and partly because she needed to stand in her kitchen alone for a moment and have a direct conversation with herself about what she was doing. The conversation was largely inconclusive. She was a practical woman, and practical women did not develop feelings for outlaws in 2 days, and the fact that the feelings were developing anyway was simply evidence that practicality had its limits. She looked up the territory law on harboring fugitives in the legal digest her father had kept on the parlor shelf. The news was not encouraging. She put the book back and made supper. That evening, the 4 of them sat at the table again, and Miss Abernathy talked at length about the challenges of teaching arithmetic to children who had inherited their parents' deep skepticism of abstraction, and Mr. Castillo described in great detail a legal dispute between 2 ranchers that he was planning to cover as the first major story for his newspaper, and Roscoe listened to all of it with what appeared to be genuine interest and contributed, at one point, a remarkably precise account of the territorial water rights law as it pertained to the specific dispute Mr. Castillo was describing. Mr. Castillo put down his fork. "You know the territorial code." "I was reading the law for a time," Roscoe said. "Before," he did not say before what, "I have a decent memory for it. After supper when Mr. Castillo and Miss Abernathy had gone to the parlor and Roscoe was again helping clear the table. Sallie asked, very quietly, "You were going to be a lawyer." "My brother was going to be a lawyer," Roscoe said. He set the plates down carefully. "I was going to be his first client." She did not ask what he meant. She thought she understood. He had been the problem and Jesse had been the solution to the problem. And without Jesse, there was nothing left but the problem. And he had turned the problem into the only kind of purpose left to him. She wanted very much to say something adequate to that. She could not find anything adequate, so she put her hand over his on the table just for a moment, just briefly, the way you would touch a wound that you could not heal but could at least witness. He looked at her hand on his. "Sallie," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like something being held carefully. "You should sleep," she said. "The mare will be ready tomorrow." He nodded. He went upstairs. Sallie stood in the kitchen and listened to his footsteps above her head, and thought that 2 days was going to be a very inadequate amount of time. Tuesday was clear and warmer, and she was hanging laundry on the line behind the boarding house when she heard the horse coming up the street at the kind of speed that Vane used when he wanted to make an entrance. She came around the side of the building and saw him dismounting in front of the boarding house a full day before his scheduled rounds, and her stomach went cold. He was not alone. He had 2 men with him that she did not recognize, not townspeople, the kind of men who hired on for particular purposes and had the look of it in the way they wore their guns. "Miss Kendrick," Vane said. He had a wide, flat face and small eyes that moved with a kind of constant calculation, and he wore his badge on his vest where it would catch the light. "Got word there might be a particular boarder staying with you." "I have 3 boarders," Sallie said. She kept her voice level and her hands steady at her sides. "As I have had for the past 3 weeks." "Uh-huh." Vane looked at the boarding house. "Mind if we take a look? Do you have a warrant?" Vane smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Miss Kendrick, I am the deputy marshal of this territory." "You are the deputy marshal of Calico Flats," she said. "The territorial marshal is in Tucson. Do you have a warrant, deputy?" One of the men behind Vane made a sound that might have been amusement. Vane's smile thinned. "I do not need a warrant to." "You do," she said. "The 4th Amendment applies in the territory the same as it applies anywhere else. And if you entered this building without a warrant and without my consent, I would file a complaint with Marshal Graves before your horse was back in its stall." Vane studied her for a long moment. He had dealt with her complaints before, and he knew she was not idle about them. And whatever calculation he was running behind those small eyes appeared to conclude that a direct confrontation was not the most advantageous move. "I am going to want to talk to your boarders," he said. "You are welcome to knock on their doors like a civilized person," she said. "They can choose whether to answer. That is how it works." He went inside. She followed him because she was not going to let him wander her house unsupervised. He knocked on Mr. Castillo's door, and Mr. Castillo opened it with his reading glasses on his nose, and the expression of a man whose important work had just been interrupted. And Vane asked a few perfunctory questions and moved on. He knocked on Miss Abernathy's door, and Miss Abernathy answered with her schoolroom voice fully engaged and answered Vane's questions with cheerful precision that left him slightly off balance. He went to the top of the stairs, first door on the left. He raised his hand to knock. "That room is empty," Sallie said. Vane turned and looked at her. "I thought you said you had 3 boarders." "2 boarders and 1 room currently in between occupants," she said. "The previous tenant left this morning." It was not a lie. Roscoe had come downstairs at 6 in the morning and said he was riding out, that he had seen Vane talking to someone outside the Copper Penny the previous evening, and that the conversation had the look of information being bought and sold, and that he would not wait another day and risk pulling her into something she should not be part of. They had stood in the kitchen in the early morning light, and she had packed him food from the kitchen without asking permission of herself. And he had looked at her with those careful dark eyes and said her name again the way he had the night before, like something being held, and she had looked back at him and said only, "Fine Doan," because that was what she could give him, the direction he needed, the permission to keep going. He had ridden out at 6:30. It was now barely 11. Vane opened the door anyway. The room was neat, the bed made, nothing on the windowsill or the washstand. Roscoe Brooks was thorough. Vane looked at the room for a long moment. Then he looked at Sallie. "You hear from any strangers passing through, you let me know." "Of course," she said, in the tone she used when she meant the exact opposite. He left. She stood on the porch and watched him ride away with his hired men, and she let out the breath she had been holding since she saw him come around the corner of the street. Then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands, and stayed that way for a while. The empty room at the top of the stairs felt like a presence all its own. 3 weeks passed. October became November, and the nights got cold enough to see your breath, and Sallie filled the empty room with a new boarder, a traveling grain merchant named Hooper, who was pleasant enough and had no interesting qualities whatsoever. And she ran her boarding house and baked her bread and balanced her accounts and tried not to listen too hard for horse hooves on Main Street. She received a letter on the 12th of November. It was written in a hand that was clear and deliberate, the hand of someone who had been trained to write carefully, and it had been posted from Tombstone. It said, "The mare is fully recovered. The trail is warm again. I think about the porch and the coyotes and the coffee that went cold. I think about a lot of things from Calico Flats. I do not know when the trail ends. I hope you are well." It was not signed, but she knew the hand. She read it 3 times and then put it in the small cedar box where she kept her important papers, between her mother's wedding ring and her father's survey notes for the homestead claim, and told herself firmly that a letter was a letter and not a promise, and that she was not going to build a life on the correspondence of a man who was tracking a killer across the Arizona territory. She wrote back anyway. She wrote about the grain merchant, and about Miss Abernathy's recent victory over the school board in the matter of a newer arithmetic curriculum, and about how Mr. Castillo had printed his first issue of the Calico Flats Courier, and that it had been received with considerable excitement and some controversy, and about how the first real cold snap had come down from the mountains and the morning smelled like frost. She said she was glad the mare was well. She said she thought about the porch too. She did not say all the other things she thought about. There was no need to overwhelm a correspondence. His reply came 2 weeks later from a place called Tres Cruces. He had picked up Doan's trail east of there and lost it again in the canyon country to the north, and he had spent 3 days with a Tohono O'odham family whose hospitality had reminded him that the territory had a great deal in it worth fighting for. And he had asked the eldest son of that family about the territory law regarding contested water claims, and had apparently had a conversation of the kind that confirmed his earlier assessment of Mr. Castillo's courage in tackling such subjects. He said the stars looked different from canyon country. He asked if the shutter was holding. She wrote back and said the shutter was holding perfectly and that she thought Mr. Castillo was going to be a very important man in the territory someday, and that the frost was getting harder in the mornings and she was making the apple preserves from the last of the season's fruit, and that she wished she had someone to tell her whether they had turned out right. December came. 2 letters. January brought one, posted from a small settlement near the New Mexico border. February brought silence. Sallie ran her boarding house and told herself very firmly that silence did not mean anything in particular in the Arizona territory in the winter of 1882 going into 1883, when the mail was unreliable and the roads between settlements became genuinely difficult, and a man tracking another man across rough country did not always have access to a post office. She told herself this daily. It helped approximately as much as such things ever help. She was on her porch on the first genuinely warm day in March, the kind of day when spring arrived in the territory not gradually but all at once, the air suddenly full of the smell of warming earth and the sound of birds that had been absent for months, when she heard the horse. She knew the sound of the mare before she saw them, knew the particular rhythm of that stride, and she was already standing with her hand on the porch rail when Roscoe Brooks rode into view around the corner of Main Street. He looked different and the same. Thinner, maybe, or perhaps just leaner in the way a long, difficult thing leaves you lean. He had the same coat, the same hat pulled low, but he was sitting the saddle differently, not with less authority but with a quality she could not immediately name, something like a weight that had been set down. He saw her before she could fully process that observation, and his face changed in a way she felt somewhere below her sternum. He came up the hitching post and dismounted and came up the steps and stopped 2 feet from her and said, "I found him." "Doan," she said. "Doan," he confirmed. "He is in a territorial prison outside Silver City. He will be there for a long time." He paused. "There was a territorial marshal involved by the end. I gave them everything I had collected for 3 years and they took it seriously. Jesse got some justice, not enough. It is never enough, but some." Sallie looked at him for a long moment. The warm March air moved between them, full of spring smells and the distant sound of someone hammering at the far end of Main Street. "Come inside," she said. "The room is available." He came inside. He ate the meal she put in front of him without speaking much, and she sat across from him and let him eat in peace. And afterward he sat back and looked at her with those dark eyes that looked different now, not less tired but tired in a cleaner way, the tiredness of a completed thing rather than an ongoing one. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what comes after. After Doan. After Doan." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I have been thinking about it for 3 months. I have been thinking about it since November, truthfully." He looked at her directly. "I have been thinking about the law degree Jesse was going to get. I have been thinking about whether a man with a federal warrant out on him might be able to clear that warrant if he had the right evidence and the right territorial official willing to hear him out." Sallie sat up a little. "Can he?" "Marshal Graves thinks he might be able to," Roscoe said. "Graves is a decent man, as it happens. He was the one who finally took the Doan case. He has looked at the original Benson incident, and he is of the opinion that the Wells Fargo account of it was based entirely on the testimony of men who worked for Doan." He paused. "The Pinkerton agent I helped that day sent a letter to Graves 6 months ago. I did not know about it until Graves told me. He said in the letter that I had likely saved his life." "Oh," Sallie said. It came out quieter than she intended. "It will take time," Roscoe said. "There is a process. Graves has to submit it up the line, and the Wells Fargo company has to review their own report, and all of it moves at the speed that legal things move. But he thinks there is a real chance the warrant gets lifted." He was still looking at her, still with that careful, direct attention. "I wanted you to know. Before I asked you anything else." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the hammering at the far end of Main Street had stopped and the birds had taken over, and the warm spring light was coming through the window and lying across the table between them. "What is the else?" she said softly. He reached across the table slowly, with the same deliberateness he used for everything, and placed his hand over hers. "I would like to stay in Calico Flats," he said, "if there is a reason to stay." Sallie looked at his hand on hers, at the scar on his knuckles that was not the same as the one on his jaw, at the roughness of his palm. She thought about the cedar box in her room with his letters between her mother's ring and her father's survey notes. She thought about what her father used to say about wanted posters and the space between the poster and the truth. "There is a reason to stay," she said. His hand tightened very gently around hers. They stayed like that for a while, in the warm March kitchen with the spring coming through the windows, and it was simple, and it was not simple at all, and it was the beginning of something that felt entirely unlike an ending. What Sallie had not fully anticipated was the speed at which Calico Flats would develop opinions. The boarding house had thin walls in the social sense if not the architectural one, and within 2 days of Roscoe's return, it was known throughout the town that the man from the wanted poster had come back to Miss Kendrick's boarding house, and by the end of the week the town had divided itself roughly into 3 camps. Those who thought Sallie Kendrick had taken leave of her senses, those who were reserving judgment pending further information, and a smaller but enthusiastic contingent who thought the whole thing was deeply romantic and were rooting for it without reservation. Mrs. Haverson, who ran the general store alongside her husband and who was the informal clearinghouse for Calico Flats social intelligence, told Sallie directly that she was concerned, which Sallie thanked her for genuinely, and then told Sallie that she thought Vane was a scoundrel and that any enemy of Vane's had her good wishes, which she also thanked her for. Roscoe, for his part, conducted himself with an unobtrusive steadiness that did more for his reputation in town than any word of explanation could have. He helped Mr. Birch, the aging blacksmith whose hands had been troubling him, with a particularly difficult job. He assisted Mrs. Ray's on the south side of town when her roof leaked after a late-season storm, carrying timber from the salvage pile behind the general store without being asked, and without making it a demonstration of anything. He found Thomas Begay's horse when it wandered out of its pen and returned it without fanfare. None of these things were calculated performances. They were simply what he did with a day when the day was his to fill. Deputy Vane noticed. Vane noticed everything that threatened his arrangement of the town's social order, and a man with a warrant who was behaving like a community member, and who was being accepted, as one was a direct challenge to the authority Vane had built on the premise that the line between citizen and outlaw was absolute, and that he was the one who drew it. He came to the boarding house on a Friday afternoon in the middle of March, and he did not knock with the formality of the previous visit, but pushed through the front door in the way he did when he was making a statement about whose town this was. Roscoe was in the front parlor talking with Mr. Castillo about the water rights article that had become a series of articles in the Courier. He looked up when Vane came in and got to his feet with the unhurried deliberateness that was his natural mode, and the two men took stock of each other for a moment across the parlor. Sallie came from the kitchen at the sound of the door. She positioned herself in the parlor doorway and said, "Deputy Vane," in the tone that meant she was paying attention. "Mr. Brooks," Vane said. He let the name sit there with all the weight of the poster behind it. "Or is it something else this week?" "It is Brooks," Roscoe said. "I have an outstanding warrant, which Marshal Graves is reviewing," Roscoe said. "You can wire Graves's office in Tucson if you like. He will confirm the review is in process and that I am to remain present and available in Calico Flats during that process." He paused. "I have a letter from Graves to that effect if you would like to see it." Vane's small eyes went from Roscoe to Sallie and back. "You got Graves involved." "Graves involved himself," Roscoe said. "He is the territorial marshal. He takes an interest in territorial matters." The air in the parlor had the quality of a thing about to tip one way or another. Sallie was very aware of the distance between her and the two men, aware of the way Mr. Castillo had gone very still in his chair with his notebook half raised, aware that this was not a conversation that was going to end neatly. "I will be watching you," Vane said to Roscoe. "I imagine you will be," Roscoe said. Vane left. The door closed behind him with more force than necessary. Mr. Castillo slowly lowered his notebook. "I am going to need to write about this," he said, in the tone of a man who recognizes a significant story when it walks through the door. Roscoe looked at Sallie. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "Let us hope the story has a good resolution before you print it," she said to Mr. Castillo. The resolution, as it happened, was still being constructed in Marshal Graves's office in Tucson, but in the meantime Calico Flats was getting to know Roscoe Brooks and finding, on balance, that it approved. He had begun, quietly and without announcement, assisting Mr. Aldridge, the territory's circuit judge who came through Calico Flats once a month, with the preparation of case summaries. Graves had mentioned in his letter that Roscoe's knowledge of territorial code was unusually precise for a man who had never formally practiced, and Aldridge, who was overworked and practical, was not inclined to turn down competent help on account of paperwork that was still being sorted. Through March and into April, Roscoe and Sallie found themselves falling into a life together that was not quite a courtship in the formal sense, because the circumstances were too complicated for formality, but which had all the substance of one. He helped with the boarding house when there were things to be fixed, and she fed him, and they spent their evenings on the back porch when the weather allowed, talking about everything from territorial politics to the books on the parlor shelf, to the particular quality of the stars over the high desert. She told him about her father and the survey notes and the homestead claim that had become the boarding house land, about her mother's garden that she maintained in the spring and summer, about the way the territory had felt like a promise when she was a child and sometimes still felt like one. He told her about Tennessee and the family he had left, about Jesse's laugh, which he said had been the kind of laugh that made strangers feel welcome, about the moment outside Prescott 3 years ago when his whole life had turned on its axis and he had let it turn, choosing grief's motion over grief's stillness. She asked him once, late in April on a warm evening with the first of her mother's roses coming up against the back fence, what he had wanted before. Before the 3 years, he was quiet for a long time. "I wanted something ordinary," he said finally. "Not small, not limited, just ordinary in the way that is actually extraordinary when you look at it close. A place, people I was responsible to, work that amounted to something." He looked at the roses. Jesse was going to be the lawyer and I was going to run cattle on the western slope. We had it planned out. A pause. "I still think about the cattle sometimes. There is land west of town," she said. "Good grazing land. The Harlow family had to sell it last spring and it has been sitting." He turned and looked at her. "I am just saying," she said, looking at the roses. He was quiet for another moment and then said, "Sallie." Again, in that way he had of saying her name like it was something he was being careful with. She looked at him. He looked back at her in the fading April light with everything in his face that he had not yet said directly, and she thought that she was going to have to say it first because he was a man who would wait a long time to make sure he was not putting something on her that she had not chosen, and she appreciated that quality enormously while also finding it, at present, slightly maddening. "I would very much like you to stay," she said. "Not in the boarding house. Here, in Calico Flats, for good." The look on his face was the look of a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been offered a place to set it down. He reached over and took her hand and held it with both of his and said, "I would like that very much if the warrant is cleared. And if it is not," he was quiet. "If it is not," he said carefully, "then I will need to think about whether staying puts you in a position you should not be in." "That is my position to decide," she said, "not yours." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he almost smiled, not the near smile she had seen before, but something fuller, something that changed his whole face and made him look younger than the tired lines around his eyes usually allowed. "Yes," he said, "I suppose it is." May arrived with its heat and its wildflowers, and it was on the 4th day of May that everything in Calico Flats came to the moment that nobody in the territory would ever quite forget. It began, as such things often do, with something small. A rumor had been running through town since the previous week that Vane had been in correspondence with a Wells Fargo investigator, one who had not been consulted by Graves's review process, and who held the original Benson version of events as gospel. The investigator was due to arrive in Calico Flats on the afternoon stage, and Vane had apparently told at least 2 people that he intended to take Roscoe Brooks into custody on the investigator's authority, regardless of what Graves's letter said. Mr. Castillo had heard this from one of the men at the Copper Penny, and had come immediately to the boarding house to relay it, arriving at 10 in the morning with his notebook and a worried expression, and his hat at an angle that suggested he had dressed quickly. Roscoe listened to the account with the stillness he always had when absorbing important information, and when Castillo was finished he said, "I appreciate you telling me." "What will you do?" Castillo asked. "I will write to Graves today," Roscoe said, "and I will talk to Judge Aldridge, who is due in town this week. And if Vane moves before Graves can respond and before Aldridge arrives," Roscoe was quiet for a moment, "then I will handle it as best I can." Sallie, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, said nothing then. She went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the counter and she thought about Deputy Vane and his small calculating eyes and the Mexican families on the south side of town, and Thomas Begay, and the form letter from the marshal's office, and all the ways that justice moved slowly when you had no one powerful pushing for it. She thought about Roscoe's dead brother, who had been 19 years old and had been riding for the Territorial Survey Office and had gotten in the way. She thought about the ways that the territory failed people who deserved better, and about the ways that the people who were failed could choose to stand still or choose to do something with the fact of the failure. She wrote the letter to Graves herself, a second letter in addition to the one Roscoe wrote, because 2 letters were harder to ignore than one, and she addressed it to Graves directly and laid out the full account of Vane's behavior in Calico Flats for the past 14 months, the invented fines and the false arrests and the current situation, and she signed it with her full name and the date and her address. She had Mr. Castillo take both letters to the telegraph office immediately. The investigator arrived on the afternoon stage at 2:30. His name was Pullman, and he was a compact, efficient-looking man in a suit that was expensive by territorial standards, and who carried a leather satchel with a Wells Fargo seal on the brass clasp. Vane met him at the stage depot with the 2 hired men from the first visit, and they walked together up Main Street toward the boarding house with the deliberate pace of men who had planned their entrance. Sallie saw them coming from the porch, where she had been watching the street since noon, with a carefully neutral expression, and her hands folded in her apron. She turned and went inside and climbed the stairs to the room at the top, first door on the left, where Roscoe was reading a case file that Aldridge had left him, and she said, "They are coming, Vane and the Wells Fargo man." Roscoe looked up from the file. His face was composed, but she knew him well enough now to see the tension at the corners of his jaw. He stood and put the file aside and reached for his coat. "Stay up here," he said. "I will not," she said. "Sallie, no," she said clearly. "We have discussed this. What happens to you is not separate from what happens here." He looked at her for a moment and then he nodded once, and they went downstairs together. They came out onto the front porch as Vane and his party reached the hitching post. Pullman had the practiced look of a man who had done this kind of work many times and preferred it to go quickly. Vane had the look of a man who had been planning this for months and intended to enjoy it. "Mr. Brooks," Vane said, "I am placing you under arrest on a warrant issued, Deputy," Roscoe said. His voice was level and controlled. "I have a letter from Marshal Graves directing that no action is to be taken against me pending the review of the warrant. If you have not received a copy of that letter, I have one inside. Marshal Graves does not have jurisdiction over a Wells Fargo warrant," Vane said. He looked at Pullman. "That is correct," Pullman said briskly. The original warrant was issued on testimony from men employed by Cutter Doane," said a voice from the side of the street, and everyone turned to look at Mr. Castillo, who was standing on the boardwalk across the way with his notebook open, and his expression that of a man who was doing the most important work of his life. "I have the documentation here, provided to me by Roscoe Brooks, documenting the connection between the Benson incident witnesses and Doane's operation. I also have a statement from a Pinkerton agent named Walsh, whose letter to Marshal Graves is on record, and who stated that Roscoe Brooks assisted him after the Benson incident and almost certainly saved his life." Pullman turned and looked at Castillo with the expression of a man encountering an unexpected variable. "Who are you?" "Ernesto Castillo, Calico Flats courier," Castillo said. "I am reporting on this matter." The 2 hired men had been watching the exchange with expressions that were harder to read, and Sallie was aware that there was a gathering on the street. townspeople drawn by the visible drama of official men and a porch standoff, and that the audience included Mrs. Haverson from the general store door, and Thomas Begay from his cart, and several of the South Side families, and young Miss Abernathy standing outside the schoolhouse with a small cluster of her older students who had obviously come out to see what the noise was. Vane had drawn his gun. It was not, strictly speaking, pointed at anything or anyone directly, but it was in his hand, and the quality of the moment changed entirely when it cleared the holster, the way temperature changes when a cloud covers the sun. Roscoe had gone completely still. He was not reaching for his own weapon. He stood on the porch with his hands visible and his face controlled and looked at Vane with those dark, steady eyes, and the space between them was about 30 feet and contained a year and a half of injustice and a 3-year trail and a dead 19-year-old boy and a letter from a Pinkerton agent and everything else. Vane said, "Step down from that porch, Brooks." Sallie stepped forward. She moved to the top of the porch steps between Roscoe and the deputy, and she stood there with her hands at her sides and her back straight, and she looked directly at Vane. The silence was absolute. The street had gone completely quiet, even the horses, even the wind. "Hector Vane," she said, and her voice was clear and carrying in the way that people who run boarding houses learn to project a voice when they need to be heard, "you are going to put that gun away." Vane stared at her. "Get out of the way, Miss Kendrick." "I will not," she said. "I will not move from this step. You know why. This does not concern you." "Everything that happens in this town concerns me," she said. "I have lived here my whole life. I watched you come here, and I watched what you did to the families on the South Side, and to Thomas Begay, and to anyone else who did not have the power to stop you. And I wrote letters about it that were ignored. And I have been waiting 14 months for someone with more authority than me to put a stop to it. And in the meantime, I am standing here on my own front steps, and you will not shoot through me, Hector Vane, because even you are not that." She heard Roscoe behind her make a sound that was not quite her name, something lower than that, something that went with the sound a man makes when something strikes him in the chest. Pullman was watching Sallie with an expression that had shifted from efficient calculation to something considerably more complicated. He looked at Vane. He looked at the drawn gun. He looked at the street full of watching townspeople, and the young man with the notebook and the woman standing on the steps with her spine made of iron. "Vane," Pullman said quietly, "we do not do it this way." Vane's gun hand was not entirely steady. His small eyes went from Sallie to Roscoe and back to Sallie, and the calculation behind them was running hard and arriving somewhere he had not expected. "She is obstructing. Put it away," Pullman said, with the flat tone of a man who was done negotiating. Vane stood there for another long moment. Then Roscoe Brooks came forward. He came down the porch steps and moved around Sallie very gently, not pushing her aside but positioning himself so that he was standing beside her rather than behind her, shoulder to shoulder at the top of the steps, and he reached down to the holster at his hip and unbuckled it. He held the gun belt out to one side and let it drop. "I am not going to draw on you," he said to Vane. "I am not going to give you a reason to make this into something it is not. If you want to take me in on a warrant that Marshal Graves is reviewing, you can do it without a gun in your hand, and I will go without trouble. But you are not going to make this a shooting over a warrant that should never have been issued." Vane looked at the gun belt on the ground. He looked at Roscoe. He looked at Sallie. The gun went back into the holster. The breath the street had been holding came out in a long collective exhalation. Pullman cleared his throat. "I would like," he said carefully, "to see that documentation Mr. Castillo mentioned, and the letter from Marshal Graves." He paused. "Before we proceed any further." It took 3 hours. They sat in the front parlor of the boarding house, Roscoe and Pullman, and the documentation that Roscoe had spent 3 years accumulating, and Castillo sat in the corner with his notebook, and Sallie brought coffee, and then sat down in the other chair, because she was not going to be removed from her own parlor. Vane had taken his hired men, and departed after the first 20 minutes with the expression of a man who had calculated a losing position and was cutting losses. And his departure had a quality of permanence about it that Sallie noted with something between relief and a kind of hollow satisfaction. Pullman read every document. He read Walsh's letter, the one the Pinkerton agent had sent to Graves. He read the chain of evidence connecting the Benson witnesses to Doane. He read the territorial marshal's account of the Doane arrest and the testimony that Roscoe had provided that had been central to it. At the end of it, he sat back and looked at his coffee cup and then looked at Roscoe and said, "You should have come to us directly 3 years ago." "I tried," Roscoe said. "The local law at that time was not interested in hearing it." Pullman was quiet for a moment. "I am going to recommend to Wells Fargo that the warrant be withdrawn," he said. "The original report was deficient. I will want to speak with Graves about the formal process." He paused. "This is going to take some time to work through channels." "I understand," Roscoe said. "In the meantime, I would recommend you remain available in Calico Flats and not draw any additional attention to yourself." Sallie looked at the parlor ceiling and decided not to say anything about the irony of that particular recommendation given the afternoon's events. Pullman left on the evening stage. Roscoe sat in the parlor after he left, and Sallie sat across from him, and neither of them said anything for a little while. And outside the window, Calico Flats was going about its evening business in the golden late daylight, people moving on the street, the sound of the copper penny beginning its nightly rotation of noise. "You stepped in front of that gun," Roscoe said. "I did," she said. "I had about 10 years taken off my life in the space of about 4 seconds, he said. "It was my front step," she said. "I have a right to stand on my own front step." He was looking at her with that full expression she had first seen in April in the garden with the roses, the one that made him look younger, the one that changed his face entirely. "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met," he said, and his voice had something rough in it that was not his usual deliberate evenness. Sallie felt heat rise in her face and was briefly irritated with herself for it. "I simply said what needed saying. You stepped between me and a loaded gun." "I knew he would not shoot through me," she said. "He is a coward who needs a gun in his hand to feel significant, and cowards do not shoot women on their own front steps in front of the whole town." "You knew that?" "Yes." "You were certain of it?" She paused. "Reasonably certain." He was quiet for a moment. Then he got up from his chair and came to her, and he crouched down in front of her chair so that their eyes were level, and he took both her hands in his and held them and said, "Sallie." "Roscoe," she said, because she had learned that saying his name had the same effect as hearing hers. It grounded something. "I am going to ask you something," he said. "And I am going to ask it right now, in this parlor, before any more things happen in this day, because I have been thinking about it for 4 months, and I think I have waited about as long as I can stand to wait." She looked at him. The late light from the window was falling across his face, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been through considerable difficulty, and had come out the other side of it alive and changed, who had set down one purpose and was reaching for another, and who was looking at her with everything he was fully visible and nothing hidden. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I would like to marry you and stay in Calico Flats and make something here, with you, that amounts to something." His hands tightened around hers. "You said it was your position to decide. I am asking you to decide it." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, "Yes." It was the simplest word and the largest one she had ever said, and it sat in the room between them like a stone being laid as a foundation, solid and permanent, and the right shape for the place it occupied. He brought her hands up and pressed his forehead against them and stayed that way for a moment, and she felt his shoulders move with the breath he let out, long and slow, the breath of a man who had been holding it for a very long time. Then he looked up at her and smiled, fully this time, the smile that changed his face and made it generous and open and entirely alive, and she thought she could spend a very long time looking at that smile and not get tired of it. News traveled fast in Calico Flats. By morning, the town knew that Sallie Kendrick had accepted a proposal from Roscoe Brooks, and the reception to this information was, on balance, enthusiastic. Mrs. Haverson had tears in her eyes when Sallie came into the general store for flour, which she covered by claiming dust, but which Sallie accepted gracefully. Thomas Begay, when Roscoe came to return a tool he had borrowed for a repair job, shook his hand with both hands and said something in his own language that Roscoe did not understand, but which Begay translated as meaning something like, "May the trail ahead be easier than the trail behind." And Roscoe said that he thought it probably would be. Miss Abernathy was thrilled in the warm, uncomplicated way of a young woman who has not yet been made cautious by disappointment, and she asked Sallie every question she could think of in the space of a 10-minute conversation, and then apologized for being nosy, and Sallie told her she was not nosy at all. She was enthusiastic, which was better. Mr. Castillo printed the story in the Courier. He printed it carefully and precisely, the documented account of Roscoe's pursuit of Doane, and the evidence that supported his account of the Benson incident, and he printed it on the same page as a thorough accounting of Deputy Vane's conduct in the territory over the previous 14 months, and the combined effect was such that by the following week Vane had been summoned to Tucson by Marshal Graves and had not returned. He was later assigned to a post in a remote section of the territory where his particular talents were considered less damaging, which Sallie thought was more than he deserved, but was better than nothing. The warrant was officially withdrawn in June. The paperwork came through Graves's office and arrived in Calico Flats on a hot Tuesday with the smell of baked earth rising from the street, and Roscoe read it twice and folded it and put it in the cedar box that Sallie had made room for him in, beside his letters and her mother's ring and her father's notes. They were married in the tilting steepled church on the third Saturday in July, 1883. It was a morning wedding because the July afternoons in the territory were genuinely uninhabitable, and the church was full to the point where people stood in the doorway and around the outside of the building, and the presiding minister, Reverend Calloway, said afterward that it was the most attended wedding in his 17 years in the territory. Sallie wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her own slightly different dimensions, and she carried the roses from her mother's garden, and she walked down the aisle of the tilting church past Mrs. Haverson and Thomas Begay and Mr. Castillo and Miss Abernathy and old Mr. Birch the blacksmith and the families from the south side and everyone else who had made themselves into the context of her life in this hard and beautiful piece of country. And at the end of the aisle, Roscoe was waiting in a new coat and clean boots with his hat in his hands, and an expression on his face that was everything she had learned to read in it over the previous 8 months, wonder and gravity, and that full smile all at once. They were married in 10 minutes of plain words, because both of them preferred plain words, and the minister said the things ministers say, and Roscoe's voice was steady when it needed to be steady and warm when it needed to be warm. And Sallie said her part clearly and without trembling, looking directly at him, because she had stepped in front of a gun for this man, and she was not going to tremble at a few words said in a church. The celebration afterward filled the street in front of the boarding house, because the boarding house was the most natural venue for a party in Calico Flats, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a guitar, and the evening went long and warm and golden, and Sallie danced twice with Roscoe, who danced with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything, and once with Mr. Castillo, who turned out to be an excellent dancer, and once with Thomas Begay, who danced with formal precision and considerable dignity, and she thought standing in the middle of all of it that this was what the territory had been a promise of when she was a child, this exact thing, this particular combination of people and music and light and belonging. By the end of summer, Roscoe had purchased the Harlow land west of town, the good grazing land she had mentioned on the April evening with the roses. He had done it with money saved from 3 years of tracking, and supplemented by what the territorial judge's office paid for his work on the case summaries, which had become regular and salaried by then, and he had begun building a small house on the property with help from Mr. Birch and the Birch apprentice and two of the Ray's family's adult sons, who had offered their labor because Roscoe had helped with the roof, and in that community labor was how accounts were kept. It was a good house. It was solid and sensibly built and had a deep porch and large kitchen windows that faced the morning light, and when it was finished in the fall, Sallie stood in the kitchen and felt the particular pleasure of a space that had been made for the right reasons by people who knew what they were making. She kept the boarding house. There was no reason not to. It had been her family's livelihood, and she was good at running it. And she hired Mrs. Florentia Ray's eldest daughter, a capable and energetic young woman named Petra, to manage the daily work, and she supervised from a comfortable combination of involvement and trust that worked very well for everyone. November of 1883 was warmer than usual, and the evenings were long and clear, and Sallie and Roscoe sat on the deep porch of the new house in the evenings and watched the sky change and talked about the territory and about what they were building and about Jessie, who Roscoe talked about more easily now, with more of the good memories and less of the weight. "He would have liked you," Roscoe said one evening, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating something they have thought about carefully and arrived at firmly. "I would have liked him," Sallie said. She had come to feel she knew Jessie fairly well through the accumulated months of conversation, the picture Roscoe had built of him word by word. "He sounds like someone who laughed easily. Easiest laugh in the territory," Roscoe said. "He could find the funny thing in anything, even things that were not particularly funny." He paused. "He would have made a very good lawyer for exactly that reason. Juries like a man who can find something human in a hard situation." Sallie thought of Mr. Castillo, whose newspaper was expanding to a second page, and who had recently broken a significant story about irrigation rights that had prompted a response from the territorial legislature. "There are people doing good work here," she said. "Castillo, Aldridge, the families who stayed and kept at it, Jessie would have fit in." "Yes," Roscoe said quietly, "he would have." The stars were coming out over the desert one by one, the way they always did, reliable as the seasons. "I am going to look into the law program at the university in Tucson," Roscoe said after a while. "Aldridge says there is a correspondence option for people who cannot be in residence full-time. He thinks I have a strong foundation." Sallie turned to look at him. "To practice law, to be Jessie's lawyer," he said. "The one he was going to be, the way Jessie would have been for people who need it." He paused. "For the families on the South Side and for Thomas Begay and for anyone else in this territory who cannot get a hearing because they do not have the right person pushing for them." Sallie looked at him for a long moment in the starlight, at the strong profile and the scar along his jaw and the set of his shoulders that was different now from the first day she had seen him on the street, lighter in some way that was not physical. "Yes," she said. "Do that." He took her hand and held it in both of his, the way he had in the parlor when he asked, the way he had when she said yes, the way he always did when he wanted to hold something carefully. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me," she said. "It was always what you were supposed to do. You just needed the trail to end." "I needed you," he said. "The trail ending was part of that." She did not argue with him about it because she thought he was right and she thought she did not need to argue with things she agreed with. The following spring Sallie told Roscoe in the kitchen one morning in March, almost exactly 1 year after his return, that she was expecting. She told him matter-of-factly because she was practical, and he stood in the kitchen and looked at her for a moment and then put his arms around her very carefully, as though she might break, which she absolutely would not, and she felt him exhale into her hair. "You are allowed to be less careful than that," she said. "I am not fragile." "I know you are not," he said. "I am being careful for myself." She laughed and held him back. Their son was born in November, just before Thanksgiving, in the house on the Harlow land with Petra Ray's serving as a calm and practical assistant and the midwife, Mrs. Cortez, presiding over the whole affair with magnificent authority. He was a healthy and extremely opinionated baby who arrived announcing his opinions loudly and did not stop for quite a long time. And when Roscoe first held him in the lamplight of their bedroom, he stood very still for a long moment, and Sallie watched his face from the bed and saw everything in it. "Jesse," he said. It was both the baby's name and a conversation, quiet and complete. She had thought of the name months before and offered it, and Roscoe had been unable to speak for a moment, and then had simply nodded. And now, looking at his face, she thought it was exactly right, exactly what the name needed to do. Jesse Brooks was a very good baby, or so Sallie and Roscoe told each other on the nights when he was less cooperative, and he had his father's dark eyes and his mother's directness. And as he grew, he demonstrated early a complete inability to be dishonest about anything, which made him simultaneously easy and exhausting to parent. Calico Flats grew in those years. Mr. Castillo's newspaper had become a genuine institution, and Castillo himself had become an influential voice in territorial politics. The South Side families had organized a community water association that had successfully litigated their water rights with Roscoe's assistance, and the victory was large enough that the territorial record mentioned it, and that several other communities in similar situations reached out to Roscoe directly. He was not yet a licensed attorney. The correspondence program at the university was taking him through his second year, but Aldridge had created an arrangement that allowed him to work as a clerk of the court in a capacity that kept everything properly organized, and the reputation he was building was solid. Miss Abernathy had married the hardware merchant's son and was expecting her second child, and was still the best teacher in the county, according to everyone who had an opinion about it. Thomas Begay had expanded his trading operation to 3 carts, and had hired 2 young men from his community, and was doing well enough that the invented fine system Vane had operated could not have touched him even if Vane were still present, which he was not. He had been dismissed from the territorial service entirely the previous year after the story Mr. Castillo published was picked up by papers in Tucson and Phoenix, and the last anyone in Calico Flats heard he had gone to California, which Sallie considered an improvement for the territory on net. On a Saturday in October of 1885, 2 years after their wedding, Sallie and Roscoe stood on the porch of the boarding house in the afternoon light, Jesse on Roscoe's hip pointing at horses with great authority, and Mrs. Haverson came across the street with something in her hand and a look on her face that combined happiness and the satisfaction of delivering good news to people who deserved it. "Wire from Tucson," she said, holding it out. The telegraph office received wires and had them delivered to Mrs. Haverson for distribution, an arrangement that had existed since before Sallie's time and that worked efficiently. Roscoe took the wire. Sallie read it over his arm. It was from the university in Tucson, and it was brief, and it said what correspondence program completion said, which was that the requirements had been satisfied and the degree was conferred. Jesse pointed at a horse on the street and made the sound he made for horses, which was an enthusiastic and inaccurate attempt at the word. Roscoe looked at the wire and then at the street and then at Sallie. His face had that full expression, the open one, the one that looked like hope built on solid ground rather than air. "Jesse," he said to the baby, "your uncle was supposed to do this." Jesse said the horse word again because he was 18 months old and horses were more immediately relevant. Sallie put her arm through Roscoe's. "He did," she said. "He just did it through you." Roscoe looked at her, and there was the whole year of letters and the porch and the coffee going cold and the roses and the front step and the parlor and everything in between in his face, the entire accumulated weight of how they had come to be standing on this porch together with this baby and this wire and this afternoon. "Yes," he said, "I suppose he did." The sun was coming down in the west, the October sun that was the same golden copper it had been on the morning Roscoe first rode into Calico Flats 3 years before, and the street of Calico Flats stretched out below them in that light with all its familiarity and all its life. The Haverson store and the tilting steepled church, and the courier's office with its new larger sign, and the sounds of the South Side families and Thomas Begay's cart, and the voices of Miss Abernathy's students released for the day, and all the ordinary, extraordinary particular details of a place where people were doing the work of building something worth keeping. Jessie would be a second child, eventually, a girl they named Clara who arrived in the summer of 1887 with her mother's red-brown hair and her father's patience, and who learned to read before any of her schoolmates, and who had opinions about everything from the beginning, and kept them her whole life. Jessie grew up to study at the law school in Tucson in his turn, the real brick-and-mortar program, and became exactly the kind of lawyer his father had described, the kind who could find the human thing in a hard situation, which made him both very effective and very well-liked, which were not always the same thing in legal practice, but in his case happened to be. The boarding house stood as long as Sallie ran it, and then as long as Petra Reyes ran it after her, and it was a good institution, and fed a lot of people, and sheltered a lot of travelers, and kept its accounts honestly for decades. Roscoe's law practice grew to be the largest in the county. He argued 2 cases before the Territorial Supreme Court. He lost one and won one and was philosophical about both outcomes. He kept Jessie's name on his letterhead, not his brother's full name, just the first name, a small private acknowledgement that only a few people fully understood, and that those who did found quietly moving. On the anniversary of the day that had become something people in the territory talked about, the day Sallie Kendrick stepped between Roscoe Brooks and Deputy Vane's gun on the front steps of the boarding house on Main Street, Mr. Castillo ran a small note about it in the Courier. He did this every year, not as a dramatic retelling, but as a simple reminder, the kind of reminder that keeps a community honest about what it values. He wrote it in the plain, direct prose that was his style, without embellishment or sentimentality, and every year people who had been there would read it and remember the silence that had settled over the street, and the sound of the gun going back into the holster, and the way the air had changed. Those who had been there always said the same thing when they talked about it. They said they had never seen Vane back down from anything before, and that they would not have predicted he would back down from that. They said that something about the particular quality of Sallie Kendrick standing on that step with her hands at her sides, and her spine straight, had changed the calculation in a way that nothing else could have. They said that what Roscoe Brooks did afterward, stepping forward and dropping his gun belt, and offering to go in peacefully, rather than give Vane the violent outcome he had been maneuvering toward, was the kind of thing you did not forget either. They said it changed what people in the territory thought was possible when a person decided to simply be unafraid. Nobody who was there ever forgot it. On a warm evening in September of 1890, Sallie and Roscoe sat on the porch of the Harlow land house, which was not the Harlow land anymore, which had been their land for 7 years, and which had the deep, satisfying quality of a place that has been lived in well. Clara was in the kitchen helping Petra, who came twice a week, and Jessie was in town at the school with a teacher who was not Miss Abernathy anymore, but who was trained by Miss Abernathy and therefore very nearly as good. The desert was doing its evening performance, the light going from gold to amber to a deep rose, and the shadows coming long across the brush, and the first coyotes beginning their conversation somewhere in the arroyos to the north. Roscoe had a legal brief he was supposed to be finishing and had set it aside. Sallie had a household account she was supposed to be reviewing and had also set it aside. They were sitting in their chairs, the 2 chairs that had replaced the original porch chairs years ago, and that had the comfortable lived-in quality of furniture that belongs to its place. And Sallie had her feet up on the porch rail the way she did when she was off duty, and Roscoe was watching the light change with the full attention he gave to things he valued. "Mr. Castillo is running the anniversary piece next week," Sallie said. "I know," Roscoe said. He asked me again if I would add a quote this year. What did you tell him? I told him what I always tell him, that the piece says what needs saying and does not need me complicating it with commentary. Roscoe smiled. What did he say to that? He said I was the most stubborn woman in the territory, which I took as a professional compliment. Roscoe laughed, a full genuine sound that had become one of the sounds she associated with home, like coyotes and wind and Jesse's voice demanding something from the kitchen. He had a good laugh, not the easiest laugh in the territory, that had been Jesse his brother, but a good one, honest and warm, the laugh of a man who found things genuinely funny rather than performatively. She looked at him in the evening light, at the face that was older now than it had been when she watched him from her kitchen window through dusty glass on an October morning. More lines at the corners of his eyes and more silver in his dark hair, the scar along his jaw that had always been pale and old, and that she had long ago stopped seeing as a scar and started seeing simply as his face. He was 40, or near enough, and he wore it the way the best men wore age, as something earned honestly rather than endured. What are you thinking about? He asked, without looking away from the sunset. I am thinking that Calico Flats has gotten considerably better in the past 7 years, she said. It has, he agreed. Mostly it is in good hands. Mostly it always was, she said. The people here were always good, they just needed someone to stop letting the bad ones run the place. He turned and looked at her. You stopped them. We stopped them, she said. The letter I sent Graves, Castillo's reporting, the water rights case, you doing the legal work. She paused. It was not one person. No, he said. It never is. He looked back at the sunset. But someone has to be first. She thought about the step. The porch step, the morning light, Vane's hand not quite steady. She had not been afraid in the moment, not precisely afraid, but she had been very aware, the way you are aware of the ground when you are standing close to a long drop, a heightened alive particular awareness of what was real and what was present and what mattered. What had mattered was this man behind her. What had mattered was every person in that watching street. What had mattered was the kind of place this could be if someone was willing to say what it was and what it was not, clearly and without moving. I would do it again, she said. I know you would, he said, and his voice had everything in it that it always had when he talked about her, that careful weight, that particular quality of a man who knows the full value of what he has. That is the part that still makes my heart stop, she smiled. Good, she said. It keeps you attentive. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand the way he had in the parlor, the way he had every time it counted. The desert went pink and then purple and then the first stars came, the ones that were always first, the ones she had been watching from this country her whole life. The coyotes were singing. The kitchen sounds were warm and ordinary. The brief on the side table waited patiently. The account book waited too. Everything was properly where it belonged and had been earned and would hold. Roscoe Brooks held his wife's hand in the evening dark and looked at the stars over the Arizona territory and thought about a brother who had been 19 years old and about a trail that had ended somewhere he had never expected and about a woman who had opened a door and told him the truth and then stood on a porch step with her spine made of iron and changed the entire direction of everything. And he thought that Jesse would have been deeply and genuinely satisfied with how things had turned out. And that this thought was a comfort and a completion, and that he was going to carry it the rest of his life with gratitude. Sallie kept her eyes on the stars and thought about her mother's roses still growing against the back fence of the boarding house, and about her father's survey notes in the cedar box, and about the first letter from Tombstone that she had read 3 times and put between her 2 most important things because it already was one. And she thought that the territory was a hard place and a beautiful one, and that the hard and the beautiful were not separate qualities, but the same quality seen from different angles. And that she was glad to be exactly here, exactly now, in this chair with this man with these stars and this porch, and all the particular ordinary extraordinary weight of a life built correctly from good materials. She was glad down to her bones. The desert settled into its night sounds. The light was gone from the west. The stars were all the way out, the full count of them, brilliant and cold and unwavering over the Calico Flats country. And that was how it was.